All right, we are going to talk about some of the central problematics of the course to try to get a kind of a bigger balcony view of the course, let's say, where we can see how all the smaller topics work together. And I like to start with this claim. This claim has a lot going on in it. It's not something that everybody who is called a feminist philosopher would necessarily agree with, the way that it's put and the form that it takes. But it arises out of sort of the body of feminist thinking that would have been going on at least before the 1980s or so, when our course really starts to pick up. So the claim here, and of course I have my conversation partner, my co-lecturer, Randy Nixon, here to listen to me and to interject, I hope, and point out some questions, whatever. So the claim here is women are oppressed as women. And this "as" here really kind of needs to be italicized in a way, because there's something really important in the "as." So the idea is that there is such a thing as oppression, that oppression affects women, and it affects them insofar as they are women. So there's something about their womanness. See, all these big concepts we have to really define in this class. Something about their womanness that makes them susceptible to certain forms of disadvantage. And it's targeted at the things that make them uniquely women, right? So this first part of this sentence, I always like to break up and ask this question here, which is, which women are we talking about? That's not really where it should be. Why don't I do that? Which women? And I like to break this one up here and start talking about, just what is a woman? What is a woman?
Oh, I thought you were going to put which women with a T.
I should have added to the list of things I wanted you to do today, cracking jokes, because that's very important. Okay, and then the other question that I like here is, what is oppression?
That's what I was going to ask.
These are not, in my mind at least, none of these are straightforward concepts. But at the same time, the theorizing impulse that gets us here is to say, well, there is something systematic happening. These disadvantages are targeted towards certain individuals with regularity. They happen with regularity. How do we come up with concepts and theories that make sense of it, right? So, for example, let's use a kind of older paradigm here, a kind of liberal feminist paradigm, which would say, women, which women? Well, we think we're talking for all women, but really we're worried about white, middle and upper class women. That's kind of who we're talking about in the liberal feminism. They're oppressed. Well, what does their oppression look like? Well, they can't vote, they can't own property, they're not business owners, they don't have full access to the economy, they're not participating in government, they're not CEOs, blah, 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 blah. That's what their oppression is. And it picks out women kind of arbitrarily or whatever. And so with that theory, who we're talking about and what's wrong, we get from that a theory of what needs to change in order to undo it. So women need access to the vote, they need to be part of the government, they need to own property, they need to be business owners, they need to be educated, blah, 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 blah. So that's one kind of way of approaching this problematic, is kind of the liberal feminist approach.
Right. And that sort of more broadly, both the responses to these questions and how they're answered, or paradigm specific more generally, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So not only do each of these questions open up further questions, which we'll talk about, but that there are bodies of theories that answer them, try to answer them in kind of sequential ways.
Mm-hmm.
Because once we get a theory of what the oppression is, it tells us what we need to do to change it.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we start talking about this question of which women we talk about, often what comes up is problems of essentialism. So essentialism is basically this idea that there's that it's possible to have a definition of a woman, that, I say the word woman and it picks out a select group of people that have shared qualities over time. And I think a lot of the, intersectional Black feminist, Indigenous feminist critique of feminism, a kind of mainstream white feminism, I guess you could put it, is to say that anytime we've tried to say these women were necessarily, smuggling in the interests of those women, their worries, their claims, their problematics, as standing in for a whole. Does that sound right?
Yeah, so essentialist definitions basically claim that there's, a fixed, sort of unified, ahistorical understanding of women, and then these other women, right, are going, actually, maybe that's not the case at all, right? That's my understanding of what you're saying anyway.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because just even thinking about the Simone de Beauvoir stuff that the students are working on is kind of like, there's an other to women, there's other women to women's absolute white woman subjectivity, right? Like there's always going to be another to your subjectivity if you're in a defining situation. This one always makes me think about Sojourner Truth, who was, she was, I believe, at the end of her life, a freed slave. And she would crash these suffrage conventions and break in them and basically say, ain't I a woman? Basically that, you're asking for all these things for women, but you're not asking for any of those things for me, and aren't I also a woman? One of her funny examples is, she says, nobody's laying their coat over a puddle so that I can walk through it. But I'm a woman, anyway, you should really look up some of her speeches. Maybe I'll post some of them. But
sorry, can I piggyback on that for a second? I think that example perfectly sort of demonstrates the way that essentialist understandings of woman are implicitly white.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. So, one way to think about the problem of the women that we're talking about when we say women in feminist theorizing is to take a kind of, not necessarily an anti-essentialist approach, so there's nothing that it means to be a woman, but a kind of flexible and contextual approach to what it means to be a woman. So, so just not being able to say that there's, woman is in some sense a product of social forces. Woman, in some sense, it has overlapping membership with people with other forms of embodiment or other social locations. And that woman is a product of a complex unfolding of a current social system and bodies, but that changes over time, and it's contextual. Yeah.
Where the Butler piece that we're going to read also sort of picks up here too, right? And we're going to be talking about that on Friday.
Yeah. Okay. And then when we get to something like what is oppression, then we're looking at something like what would it mean to have a social force that's causing systemic disadvantages, right? Because you could imagine the skeptic saying, well, women's position, I mean, this is what especially, first and second wave feminists were responding to. Women's oppression is a result of their intellectual inferiority, their biological weakness, their role in reproduction. They kind of would naturalize this position of marginality. And so the feminist theoretical response is to kind of come up with a set of concepts that explain how women's position in society is not natural, right? There are forces that are causing and shaping it to be. So what are some of these feminist specific tactics that create women's marginalization? So one of them would be sexual violence. So just the domination through sexuality. And, another one could be sort of like family and reproductive control. So forced pregnancies, lack of access to reproductive justice, that kind of thing. One is through appearance and objectification. So if people are really worried about what they look like and attributing, so ways of attributing value to women according to very narrow physical standards is a way of lessening their ability to, be free subjects or whatever. Sexual control, economic control. So basically their relative poverty without their attachment to patriarchy. Domestic labor is very taxing. Caring labor. This is something that is not remunerated for, takes up a large amount of time, and so on. And then what happens when we start picking out some of these systems of that produce women's marginality, it starts to spin up into larger systems that interlock with that. So we can say these things vary by one's relationship to heteronormativity, with one's relationship to sort of colonial structures. Well, what about coloniality? Let's call it that today. Imperialism. I started typing it before I thought it through.
Yeah, I was going to say, I like it, but not with two L's. So
listen, multitasking. So then what we're doing in feminist theory is we're looking at how these phenomenon connect up with larger patterns. And what's one of the things that's problematic with this claim women are oppressed as women is that it's what we like to call now in retrospect single axis thinking. So it just has a single concept, woman oppressed as women. Well, what about queer women? What about queer women of color? We have a lot of different dimensions. Now, we don't want to just say that each one of these identity factors are pop beads that we just kind of add on to the string, and each one of them is separate from each other. The theory of intersectionality is to really think about that intersection, the collision of forces, creating new forms of oppression, new systems themselves. So we theorize them separately at some points, but we have to always be going back and forth between seeing their singular and their intersectional dimensions. At least that's how I do it. Otherwise, you're sort of theorizing everything and nothing at the same time. You have to think a little bit single and then intersectional, back and forth, and always be correcting and revising. That's kind of how I think of it.
I think of it as like zooming in and then zooming out.
Yeah.
You zoom right into one particular identity or experience, but then you kind of have to zoom out again.
Absolutely. So then I'm sure I'm missing some things here, but I just want to also kind of charge up this question here, which picks out an important issue when, of course, we're answering the kind of bigger skeptic about women's position in society as being sort of natural based on their bodies, which is whatever this relationship is between sex and gender. So one of the claims that is used to, keep women in a marginal position in society is that there's this certain kind of body, and that body, it has certain features to it that result in a kind of gendered expression that then comes with it certain forms of, let's say, labor, desire, interests, identities, expressions, whatever. Whereas, the sexed body supposedly, is has become its own area, and we're going to talk about this in the course. It's become its own area of feminist theorizing, because it's just not clear to me that, first of all, a sex leads to gender. That sort of was taken care of in the 80s and 90s, but it's also not clear to me that whatever it means to be sexed is this kind of brute natural fact about bodies. And that actually sex is something that we assign. It's something that we carve up. Nobody's going to say there aren't trends about what bodies tend to look like, but there's a lot of variation within that. And even when you have something like rates of intersex at something like one for every 1,000 or something like that, that once you start looking at how many people there are, that's actually a significant number of people that should count against any kind of theory of bodies that they come in two sexes alone, and that those sexes lead to a gender of some kind. So then this whole sex gender discussion for me opens up questions of how the body is a site of social construction.
Absolutely.
Instead of just gender as a site of social construction, how is the body a site of social construction? Yeah. And so we'll definitely talk about that in the class. Actually, one of the things I was thinking about here that we're going to talk about in this class is that you have an article that talks about how the family acts as a way of trying to reinforce heteronormativity. So students will be looking into that. And then we also have quite a bit on sexual violence. And the reason it's there is because it does help us understand these persistent systems that keep women as a sort of overlapping membership group, but as a social group that can be picked out as victims of violence so regularly.
Right, and I think the sex gender distinction of sex as biology, gender as culture or society is a really good place to start, right? And I think that that's why it's often reiterated as such. But once you start thinking about it, it's so much more complicated than that, right? And I think that's a lot of the readings that we're going to be talking about bring that out, that this is a good entry point. But when it comes to it, as you're saying, biological sex is as constructed as gender identities, right?
Well, yeah, and if we say that this one's biological and that this one's from society, it's like, it makes it seem like one is fully determined, whereas one is just made up by society. But right. you can correct both sides of that, and you can say, actually, there's a lot of predetermination in our worlds of cultural meaning and cultural systems that determine a lot of what gender is. And that the biological is not as determined as it might seem to. So we kind of have to keep both sides of that barbell in check.
Because we can't act as if the biological and the social are separate entities, right? It's obviously more dynamic than that, right?
Yeah. And so this bigger problematic that I like to introduce makes it seem as though, well, hopefully presents for you the questions that we have, which is, how do we theorize women? What explains their oppression? Like, we could theorize women and not be feminist philosophers. we were like, what is gender, you know? But that has to be connected to this political commitment to the problem of women's marginality in society, which we can list facts upon facts upon facts for. But they have a marginal status in society, especially, you know, certain subsets of women and so on. But then also we can be not necessarily feminist philosophers, but be worried about, you know, how sex and gender relate. What are they? How do they relate? Right? But what it's this middle part here, which leads to kind of the last bit that goes with feminist theorizing. That's a therefore sign. Okay.
I was like, person?
I've been working a lot on Zoom whiteboard, and
Really good. I'm very impressed.
I'm just getting to the point where it looks like I'm writing with my left hand. I'm right-handed, by the way. Therefore, resistance / liberation. So this whole problematic has within it a normative punch at the end, which is that we don't just go, oh, that's what women's oppression is.
You should explain what normative means.
Normative means it goes to the area of theorizing that sort of makes an argument for the way that things should be, not just the way that they are. So a normative claim is a descriptive claim is women are oppressed. A normative claim is women should not be oppressed.
Yeah.
See what I mean? So all of this is going to some kind of ultimate upending of this system. We want to end, we're doing a diagnostic on the oppression because we want to change it. And there's a really interesting sort of political consciousness raising going on right now, where I would say about 15 years ago, resistance was very much considered a sort of individual thing, right? Well, you know, if I don't do this one thing, then I'm not participating in patriarchy. I think there's really been a sort of consciousness raising about things being systemic, going beyond the individual, and not sort of, because if you think it's you in particular that has to resist all of this oppression, it's very daunting. It leads to these sort of feminist guilt issues, like why haven't I liberated my internal, you know, monologue that was created by patriarchy or whatever. That's really not the kind of thing that individuals do. You know, political communities have to form resistances. And however, when we're doing theory, we can still theorize forms of resistance that would be effective. We're not doing it, but we're still saying, here are the kinds of resistance that are entailed by what we have diagnosed on the oppression side.
And also, you know, individual resistance, like practices or acts of individual resistance, are also public and end up being collective, right? Like small acts of resistance at a family dinner table get noticed, right?
Yes.
Or in a friend group. So I think that there's a bridge there too between sort of the individual and the broader collective, and that's, you know, thinking about groups, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a whole other area of feminist theorizing is around what it means to organize, politically organize. Do we have to have the same identity in order to organize? Or do we have to be committed to the same causes and form coalitions around those causes? There were periods of time, and there are groups that would say we have to have the same identity in order to do this political organizing, and there's a tension there. I'm not going to come down on any one particular side with that, but there are problems around political organizing and how that works. And then feminist philosophy gets really self-referential when we start thinking about how power dynamics operate within those organizing communities, and how they can be their own form of oppression. Right? How let's say white feminism can become disciplinary about what is feminism. I remember giving this whole problematic once and talking to Cressida about it, and she said, well, I wouldn't even use this term oppression, I would use the term discipline. which again is a different set of concepts and theories, right? You're going to be talking about disciplinarity in this course too.
And again, sort of paradigm specific, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. What we're trying to just kind of give a, like I said earlier on, a kind of balcony view of these topics, because it might not be clear right away why we're dealing with the different things we're dealing with. So, for example, the second sex is dealing with this question: how has society made it such that certain groups of people get turned into a lesser status? And then, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, other than Beauvoir, who's on the roster for sort of pre-1980s feminist philosophers?
Nobody. And
Okay.
in this
I was like, I feel bad for not knowing this, but that's...
No, but it's okay, because in this class, this is the second half of kind of history of feminist thought. And so that class often goes up to Beauvoir,
right,
sometimes includes it. So this will be a repeat for some students, but they're going to be getting it differently from us.
right.
When I taught history of feminist thought 301, I taught up into the 70s and 80s, past Beauvoir. I taught woman hating. I taught Dworkin's woman hating, and I taught Schmidt Firestone and other people like that. So I think there's going to be some overlap.
Right.
But this next unit that Randy's going to be taking on with Judith Butler, and Judith Butler, Iris Marion Young, and Diane Chisholm, this is all talking about how bodily comportment builds into gender. And that's really cool. And then I'm going to be talking about specifically how we carve up bodies into sexes. And then we're getting to this idea of disciplining the family. Then we're going to talk about intersectionality and critical race theory. So really, really pushing on this question of the woman that is implied in feminist theorizing, and how to work with that. And then we'll be talking about the carceral system as one of these, I think, often not as prominent systems that's taken into account when we're starting to talk about how all these systems interlock, overlap, interlock, one of the two.
Interlock and overlap.
That's true. And then Randy, why don't I let you explain how you see affect, where you want me to put affect theory?
Oh, that is tricky. Well, I think that affect theory can be integrated into any of these questions in a way, but probably, in terms of probably the what is oppression question, because when we're thinking about these specific forms of oppression, so sexual violence, heteronormativity, right, and especially the resistance liberation, right? I think that when we're thinking about how to politicize, why we politicize, what goals we have, and as you were talking about the questions about, when we're organizing, do we all have to have the same identity, right? I think all of these questions of, the political and organizing against or, to end these oppressions, that's where affect sort of merges kind of between the resistance question and the oppression question.
Good. I like it. And then the Jenny Berman one is you're trying to do some of this stuff and also think about colonialism and intersectionality.
Yeah, it all becomes so interwoven, right?
Go ahead.
Oh, it all becomes so interwoven, right? It's hard to... That's why I think that having these three overarching, like, organizing questions is really useful. And then we can think about how each of the authors is sort of situating themselves in relation to each of these questions, right? Or where they...
Yeah, because the individual articles that we choose are going to seem really, really zoomed in, because they're dealing with really detailed problems. Yeah. And then we're going to go on to talk about sex and consent, which for at least for the first reading, where I'm talking about Nancy Tuana, is going to make a connection here between sexed bodies, what we know about sexed bodies, and how that feeds into not necessarily sexual violence necessarily, but some kind of a sexual system that
Mhm.
is oppressive. Because sexual violence isn't the only way that the gendered system is oppressive, let me say,
Right.
around sexuality.
Absolutely.
And then we're going to talk about rape, sexual abuse, and consent. And basically, it's going to be a deep dive into how this aspect, the pervasiveness of this aspect for women, and in a non-essentialist way, because I'm going to be talking also about disability too, disability and sexual abuse. This is, yeah, because you could put in here as well, sort of like able-bodiedness, able-bodied. Uh,
Ableism. Yeah.
um, and that being another sort of system that oppresses. I mean, disabled women are at a very high risk of abuse, and that abuse looks a lot like bigger forms of patriarchal violence that we've seen. Um, and so that's kind of how the course wraps up. So you can see the sort of these bigger questions.
Mm. Lots of good stuff.
Well, thank you
Like
for
not
being.
uplifting, but you
Go
know.
ahead.
I said lots of good stuff, then I said not uplifting necessarily, but important.
Yes, I think as a feminist philosopher, sometimes I feel like, why didn't I just do my PhD in logic? Because I don't care about logic, and it's just kind of fun things to think or whatever. But yeah, this stuff is affectively draining to work on, because it of course cuts through our identities in various ways. And anyway, we will try to keep the energy up. Actually, that's a really good reference to the work on the killjoy, the affective work on the killjoy. Is putting the joy back in killjoy. Okay, well, we will stop there.
Sounds good.